Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Turbocharge tomorrow. Happy October. Happy Tuesday. Welcome, Nicole.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you.
Awesome. We usually give people about 30 seconds to kind of join, probably from their last meeting. How's your morning started?
Pretty good so far. We've got some lovely weather here in California.
You're over in
It's
California. I'm in Chicago. So we got the fall on, we got the vest on. I love it. Well, awesome. Well, as people continue to join, welcome, welcome, welcome. We're going to get started, Nicole, because we got a lot of ground to cover today. Honestly, it feels like not a day, or should I say, not an hour goes by when we don't hear of a new innovation, a new version of ChatGTP, a new version of Meta's glasses. But also, I'm over here in Chicago, and it feels like a quarter doesn't go by when a large tech giant's not cutting a check to me for violating some of my biometrics. And so it's so interesting because I feel like all the headlines are on the innovations, but you and I were chatting. I'm so excited because this conversation is the balance. We came up with the title All Gas, No Brakes. And what we're going to talk about today is how to continue to roll out these innovations because it's not slowing down. In fact, you and I both believe some of these innovations are going to continue to accelerate. But whether you're in a smaller startup environment or a large corporate environment, how to do so, how to move quickly at speed while still protecting users and the organizations that you work with. So I couldn't be more thrilled to welcome you in, Nicole, head of anti-piracy strategy and technology over at Prime Video and Amazon Studios. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here. And like you mentioned, this is probably one of my biggest sticking points and greatest passions is the discussion between technology and consideration over how we use it in our lives and then use it securely and effectively to kind of drive ends.
Awesome. I know a lot of these topics are emotionally charged for people, how people's data are being used. I know there's some sensitive conversations, but I also know you have some pretty candid opinions in hearing you talk. So I'm really excited to get some of your perspectives. So if you're ready, let's dive right in. Um, so let's start with this. There are a lot of instances. I started at the top of the hour when some of the data is being misused by tech organizations. What do you think that is? What are some of the primary causes? Do you think companies are just moving too fast to race to bring an innovation to market? Do you think there's some folks that are trying to skirt some of those to stay ahead competitively? What do you see?
Um, so when it comes to kind of user privacy and user data, I think it's a blend of multiple different things, especially across this innovation spectrum. I'd say 9 times out of 10, it's not a malicious instance. It's mostly people moving forward and not realizing the content of what's in their actual technology or what they're implementing. And so they kind of get those blinders on of we just got to get this to market, and there's nothing in here that somebody would want to use that could potentially be concerning or threatening to consumers. But usually when that happens, they find out later on that there are bits and pieces of that information that people could use in a way that were not intended, or it's just not the way that people wanted it to be used. So even if they tried with the best intents, they may find themselves in a position where it's unfortunately being regulated or examined after the fact. And so that can also feel very jarring both for the consumer, but also the people who are working in that innovation space.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's good to hear that perspective. So, from what I'm hearing you say, it's a lot about how do we reorganize teams. And we're going to talk today about some of the shifts that are happening and how teams are working together and collaborating, right?
Absolutely. So one of the biggest things that comes to me as a security practitioner of well over 20 years now, the way that I like to think of any type of innovation, but also awareness of the landscape in the security space is security is a ship that is always sailing in the horizon, and we are always sailing towards it. We may never reach that ship, but it's always something that we want to try and do just to take ourselves forward and closer. So by having that kind of forward thinking approach, it allows companies and individuals to consider what do I need to consider that I don't know about. in this space, because each piece of technology and each piece of innovation is going to have interesting quirks or, excuse me, applications that you may not have awareness of. And so by rearranging your teams and finding ways to integrate security all the way through your roadmap, it allows you to then be aware of, even if they are edge cases, situations where you typically wouldn't imagine that this piece of technology will catch someone's eye or maybe even be the next big data breach. It gives you that opportunity to not only kind of visualize it, but also plan for it so that if something does come up, you're not stuck holding the bag with no idea what to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So, talk to me a little bit about how you feel like the ideal organization is setting up either some of those teams or some of those checkpoints or some of those communication protocols throughout the process of developing a new innovation or bringing a new innovation to market.
So what I've seen is obviously across businesses, they're all going to have their own development methodologies and the way that their teams work. But the way that I've seen the most successful deployments have been where the security teams are not only treated as partners instead of guards or gatekeepers, but also where relationships are built between the business teams and the product teams and the security teams, even the engineering teams, so that you can have regular candid conversations about things of interest that you may want to bring into your pipeline. You can have the discussion over this is or is not a good solution or choice because of these issues. And by kind of building that safe space within your company or within your development pipeline, you create the opportunity to have the discussion and kind of harvest or seek dissent, which allows you to build a more robust viewpoint on what the situation is. Because even if you do come to the understanding that there may be a security issue or there may be a concern with privacy in the future, as long as you're aware of that risk and it's not an immediate impact risk now, then you may choose to move forward with that deployment, application, etc. But as long as you're aware of the risk that's coming with it, then that kind of helps balance things out so that you're not caught off guard if that thing that you perceived actually does come true. So being able to have that there, and by creating those partnerships across teams so that you understand that your security team is not coming in to just tell you no.
Yeah.
And sometimes that takes finding the right security team because there are nuances between it. There's security where this is required, and then there's security where it's business continuity security,
Yeah.
and having kind of a meld of those two is also very important.
It's so interesting, what I'm continuing to hear you say is, we have courageous technology leaders here that are listening today. So that's across functions, but it's having the right people in the right seats in the bus. But then both internal and any external partners you have really working to build those teams and, the fundamentals, the interpersonals, bringing people together, maybe even outside the projects to get to know one another. So they feel like they can speak up or they're asking the right questions and they can have those candid conversations versus things that may be more transactional or in a product roadmap, a check the box type deal, right? Is that fair?
Yeah. Yeah, I find that when you kind of stick to that rigid, especially when you're coming to the ideation space or you're trying to bring in new technology to either accelerate what you're working on or build out what your current offering is, that's the time that you really need to break down those barriers. Because even if maybe you don't want to hear what the security team has to say or the engineering team has to say, having that discussion at the outset allows you to kind of think it over and figure out how can we get around these obstacles, what can we do to differentiate ourselves in this space so that should this come up, this is not something that will impact our company, or if it does impact us, we already have a plan in place so that that's there. And by building that kind of regular conversation and strengthening that muscle, it's less of kind of an onerous task where you feel like you have to go ask the security team to review things. When it's a little more I, friendly, always sounds a little dismissive, but when it's a
Sure.
little more friendly and less transactional, then you typically don't have to have as many long drawn out conversations there, because sometimes you catch somebody online and say, I've seen this, have you heard about it, any ideas about it? And then you can kind of build from there rather than creating this kind of large ceremonial event that you would have of like, we're kicking this off and it's going to do this, and also now security will review it. typically that never ends in a very positive experience for everybody because security ends up telling somebody in that pathway, you can't do this, or if you do this, this is the risk and it's kind
Yeah.
of big. So,
It sounds like what I'm hearing you say is if you, as a technology leader, feel like there's at all an adversarial relationship between design, between development, between security or QA, then that's your cue to say something's breaking down here, and I need to, revisit this, kind of immediately.
absolutely. Having any of that kind of friction there, that should really key you into there is a problem. I don't know where that problem might be, but you want to be able to have those candid conversations around the technology that you're looking at. And there are people who don't want to have those discussions. You may need to look into why do they not want to have it? Because if they're pushing for you to move to market on something that they think doesn't need this review, or they don't want to potentially slow it down because of the security review,
Yeah.
that's also a concern that I would have because they're not considering the long term impact of what they may be bringing forward.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to keep us moving. This week, I haven't stopped reading about OpenAI. Not only a little bit of their brain drain, the drama, but also the move to for-profit from non-for-profit. Almost 9 years ago, I didn't realize it was around 2015, 2016. So, I want to get your perspective as virtually every technology team now explores, rolls out experiments, and starts to roll out larger scale generative AI and large language model based experiences. Like, what should we be looking for as technologists that maybe aren't as intimate with some of these models that we're leveraging, or as we work to build our own LLMs in house?
So I think one of the biggest things is being aware of both the limitations and some of I, I would consider them to be foundational impacts of using AI or large language models or really anything machine learning based, where it's taking a lot of inputs in, kind of synthesizing them, and then creating an output. One of the things that you have to consider as you deploy LLMs or any type of AI assistant or AI technology is how is this trained? One of the major concerns is making sure that it does not have bias within its groups. So you've heard news stories of where counties or cities have used AI for crime identification, and studies show that typically these are trained on information that is incredibly biased. And so it creates a terrible experience, not only for the people who are impacted by that, but also for the people who have to implement this and potentially take it back down
Yeah,
because there is some innate bias in how things are trained. So, doing very intense due diligence on how your LLM will be trained, what the content is. Are you allowed to have that trained content in there because you don't want to deploy something and then find that you have to pull it back down because it was trained on content that you're not licensed or authorized to use, and now
yeah,
you're stuck in that limbo. So that's one of the big considerations there. But also, you have to be considerate of how is this going to be used, and is it going to be used in a way that will actually help both the customer but also move the company forward. So typically in workspaces, you want to implement AI in places where there may be aspects that humans don't have to take part in that. So like customer service intake, initial touch points, or areas where you're maybe not handling sensitive data or things like that, where you can automate it out or even help the humans in the process get rid of some of the tedium. So, video editing can be very tedious. Sometimes you just want something to go through and do those basics when you're getting
yeah,
stuff started. Using AI there is really helpful, but having the idea that AI is going to replace your human workforce or things like that can be very detrimental because there are a lot of things that humans, as perceptual units, can do that a computer
yeah,
can't because we have told it what it can and can't do. So there are those considerations, but there's also the consideration of if I am putting this into my environment and I don't fully know all of the extent of what it can do, is that something that I want it to do?
yeah,
So even though you may build the best house, and you may put a lock on every door, if you leave that tiny little window over the bathroom sink or shower open, somebody will get in. And so that's kind of how I think of it with this new technology. You built a great house and it has locks everywhere, but if there's a crack, something
Yeah.
will get in, and you need to be aware of that.
All right, let's go back to our title, Cole. It was all gas and no brakes. So just this week, I literally read back to your crime instance. There was one county in the United States I was reading that the mayor was heralding this LLM as being able to do 30. The headline was 30 years worth of crime detection in 8 hours. And right. And so exactly to your point, that's being trained on potentially 30 years worth of bias. So if you're advising that county, if you're advising them, I feel like we've been waiting for the accessibility of it. We've been talking about this for probably a good 10, 15, 20 years to have the benefits of AI this accessible, and it's finally here. So we're rushing.
Yeah.
What are you advising to that county, that county board, that mayor in that
So
instance?
in those instances, I would always advise one, maybe you don't make a press release about it quite as soon until you have something that looks like a legitimate case study. So when you're launching these experiments, the driver is what will this do and how does this impact or like align with what we're building business wise or how we're following our vision. And if you don't have something in there that allows you to take that information and give both inputs and then the resulting
Yeah,
outputs, it's not going to be useful for people. So when you're doing these kind of test runs within your county or
yeah,
things like that, it could be trained on this old data. And I think that's actually valid, at least to say, we trained it on all of this old data. This is its success rate based on this data, but we also have to quantify what of this data might have bias, which, considering it's 30 years, I'd say almost all of it
yeah,
has something in there that may
yeah,
not be good. So that's the other thing, is making sure that you have solid data hygiene and data management so that if you do need to go back and say, like, we built this LLM, it does all of these great things. So conceptually, it's great, but we may have to go back to the drawing board because our data is bad.
yeah.
Having that kind of pathway to work your way back on that is really important. And it also saves any of your data modeling or data scientists a ton of time because then they don't have to go through and rescrub.
Yeah.
So in that instance, I would say rather than tell everybody how successful it's going to be or something like that, you can tell them that you're hopeful and that you'd be following up with a case study to
Yeah,
give
yeah,
example information, especially because I would never say anything about solving a real life case because what if that person now has their hopes up waiting for you? So,
it's just tough. You know exactly how virtually every one of these conversations is probably going, both in the boardroom and at the county level. Is the technology team is building this experience, it's training the model, and then when the demonstration happens to the executive, the leader, the mayor, right? It's 2 clicks. It's
yeah.
extremely impressive, and the results are powerful. So in that very emotive state, it is very hard for anyone to apply those breaks. You can see why then the mayor goes, within the next day, the next week, the next month, and touts the benefit of that. So let me ask you this, Nicole, like, whose responsibility is it? Is it in the technology team designing the experience? Is it in the technology leader team that are bringing that experience? Is it in the executives? Whose responsibility is it to make sure that there are some breaks along with the gas as we move forward?
So I think it's a little bit of everybody's responsibility there, at least when it comes to moving something forward in a positive direction. So from the technology team developing it, you want to make sure that as you put things together or present things to whoever you're presenting to, as necessary, you give them the caveats of the data. This data may
Yeah,
be old. This data may not be accurate. This may not meet what we're looking for. However, it is some form of evidence. Even if it shows that your test failed, that still counts as something that you can use. And so building up that awareness within your teams of like, not everything will be a success is important because everybody expects if you've got this new technology, all you do is apply it, you flip the switch, and you get something good out.
yeah,
And I'm sure everybody would love for that to happen, but in my experience, that has never happened deploying any type of innovative technology. You typically have a couple of rounds where you fumble. And so by building in that, I guess, awareness or acceptance that like it's not all going to be slam dunks every time we do this, but we are learning along the way, then as it goes up the leadership chain, hopefully your leaders will also take in that information of we're doing cool things, we're doing things quickly, and we're staying on like this cutting edge. But sometimes it's not going to be pretty, and sometimes it's not going to be something that we need to have a press release about. And then from the kind of top down, the leadership needs to understand what they're asking for. So when you ask for your people to deploy AI, you need to know why. What are we going to use this for? How is it going to impact or benefit us? Are we just adding it in to kind of get those buzzwords? Because we're actually seeing that people have a bit of a burnout on AI as a buzzword.
Yeah.
They're actually preferring to take products that don't mention AI or don't have it integrated because for
Wow.
them, they feel very conflicted about it, but also it does kind of feel like it gets applied to everything. Like it's new cereal branding. This is much more nutritional or something like that. So people have started to kind of have that backlash. So being able to know exactly why are we using this and how does this benefit our goal, because then you can translate that down the chain and people understand instead of like, hey, here's a new AI thing that tells you the color of cars that pass by every day. Like, great. What are we going to do with that?
Yeah.
So you want to make sure that it's precise.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say is it's really all of our responsibilities if we're, utilizing these tools on a day-to-day basis, but especially if we're in a leadership position, either on the technology side or the business side, to educate ourselves and to be able to go into those meetings and ask the right questions. Or once you see that experience that's run, to digest it, take a pause, and then come back
Yeah.
to the team and ask the right questions, right?
And even if it's not something that you like, not every CEO or not every executive is going to have the technology background to be able to assess things. So being able to recognize when you need to tap somebody else to come in and maybe
Yeah.
give you the insight, I think is really helpful because honestly, nobody is going to know everything, and try having that expectation on yourself of I should know all of this technology is just going to stress you out, and
Yeah.
it's probably just not going to make you very willing to even interact in that space. So knowing when to tap somebody else, even if it's from with outside of your organization, to bring in a consultant or somebody who works in that space, they can give you more or less an objective perspective on this is what the issues are. And then from there, you can kind of use that to build out further understanding or even ask your own questions so that you get your specific understanding, not just kind of the high level.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, this is a big thing. We started talking this discussion about how teams are reorganizing themselves to set themselves up for success, and I want to hear you talk about kind of the concept of shift left and the traction it's gaining within not only security circles but more importantly engineering circles. What's shift left?
So shift left is it's a security concept, at least as far as I'm familiar. It's where rather than having kind of the sectioned deployment approach where you have your product ideation and then it moves into like product development and then it moves into engineering and then eventually it makes it to security for that one last check before it hits the road. That's not very effective when it comes to really any kind of development process. If you were building a car, you wouldn't want to leave considerations for like what happens if it crashes until the very end because you put all of that time and money into building that.
Yeah.
And if they tell you, well, you have to scrap the whole thing and start over, that's time, money, and resources that you've now
Yeah.
lost. And the same thing goes for security and like privacy considerations. If you bring in the security aspects from it at the very beginning of ideation and walking through, then that gives you the opportunity to identify areas where this is going to have impact, or we may need to bring in consultants for this because we don't have somebody to meet the legal federal regulatory requirement, or we are potentially putting something into our product that we're not entirely sure of, but it should have some features for security to maybe even integrate with other companies' offerings and things like that. So it's always very helpful to kind of have all of the essentially working units who would be a part of that final deployment at the table from the beginning, rather than kind of metering out. Most of the time you hear, don't invite security, they're going to tell you no. And they're probably going to tell you no about a lot of things, but at the beginning, it's better to hear no before you've already put that work in, then at the end, when you hear no, and also it's going to cost X amount.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the concept there.
I feel like it really comes back to that thing we were talking about team organization and team design. And I feel like that's so critical too, especially as you have partners, external partners. So often it's, I need this profile, but is it asking the right question of how is this profile going to fit into my process? And am I doing enough to onboard that person and introduce that person, especially in our
Yeah.
largely remote world, right? You just I continue to hear that theme from you.
Yeah, I think some of the organization there, like it may require having a couple of in-persons as well. I try to typically, with remote teams, have at least one in-person per quarter, just so not only you
Yeah.
see each other, but you get that opportunity to have some of those more organic discussions that come up around other things. But even when you're bringing new people in, even if you're bringing consultants in, it's always helpful to kind of bring them in so that they feel welcome, and that way you can kind of build that rapport. So even if maybe you don't have them contracted, they may contact you in the future and be like, hey, this has come up and I think it will impact your company as well. Would you like me to look into this for you? So that way you're kind of building, it's transactional a little bit, but you're building that kind of network there so that maybe even if you don't have the security people within your company, you have a little bit of a support system.
Yeah, absolutely. Amazing. Okay, we've got time for about two more topics, Nicole. I want to talk about Americans' perceptions of data privacy and how their data is being utilized. I've been amazed over the last decade how you continue to see the surveys between European users and American users, and the gaps are closing a little bit in how Americans perceive their data has been using. But despite a lot of the breaches, we are still far more lax. Like, give us a temperature gauge on kind of data privacy and data utilization in America as we kind of wrap up 2024 and head into 2025.
So I think we're definitely moving into kind of I, I don't know where we're on the temperature scale, but I'd say we're moving towards prime time for data privacy within
Yeah.
the US. So just for whatever reason, there are numerous reasons why the EU and other places in the world, they focus more on data privacy. And it is moving over and becoming more prevalent here in the US, thankfully, because we have a little more of a consolidated view of this rather than each state having to, I mean, granted, each state still has to put out their own requirements, but I think it's becoming a little more wide known and a little more understood that even though you think that these bits and pieces of information may not impact you greatly, as we
Yeah.
start to see it actually impact us more heavily and we see that people are targeting that information, we understand that it does have value. Even if we can't see it, if somebody else does see that value, then we should maybe also put that in there. And also introducing things like being aware of child use on technology because
Yeah.
30 years ago, not every child had a piece of technology, and now it's hard to find them without a single piece of
Yeah.
technology. So we've had to very rapidly come to the understanding that these are different spaces, and we also have to start to kind of step up and take control and
Yeah.
custodianship over this data.
Yeah, I mean, how often have we heard in the last 10 years that like how much data that we're collecting as a society, and we often, as technologists will say the underutilization of that data. Well, all of a sudden with these large language models, there is that utilization of the data, and so it will become very interesting
Yeah.
as more of that data gets surfaced, as you start to, and we all start to realize how much data has been kind of collected and how that data is going to be surfaced and used. So we may be entering a new chapter here. All right, Nicole, I'm going to
Absolutely.
get you out of here on this. It's called Turbocharge tomorrow for a reason. We're trying to pull tomorrow forward to today. So if you could have one process, one strategy, one mindset for our audience that you would recommend that maybe they have on their roadmap, but what should they pull forward either to this afternoon and this week to make a priority for themselves and their teams?
So I think the thing that you want to keep in mind for any kind of turbocharging or successful moving forward is the investment in security and privacy. It may seem like a lot now, and it may seem like a lot at the beginning, but it's like insurance. Hopefully, you put that time and money into it and you're prepared and you never hear about it. Nine times out of 10, that's not going to happen, though. Something will happen, and you want to have that awareness and security there. So, even when it feels like maybe there's not a lot of attention on security or privacy, that's not the time to kind of scale back and reduce on it, especially as we see budgets change and things like that. Cutting into your security program or your privacy program are pretty much your number one don'ts because you're basically cutting the legs out from anything that you would be doing. So keeping in mind that's the investment that is going to be critical, not only at the executive level to be able to explain how you have taken on kind of custodianship or liability for protecting that aspect, but also for a successful deployment. You don't want to be the one who's stuck behind having to fix,
Yeah.
17 years worth of security patches.
100%. Sometimes it seems like table stakes, but then again, it's amazing when you read the headlines. Sometimes we just need some of those reminders. So thank you so much, Nicole. This has been awesome, fabulous. We very much appreciate you joining us in the studio today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Have a great day.